in the room, and then we have about that much, if not more, online. So this is a hybrid event where we're having here, so online and in person. And look, thank you everyone for kind of sparing some time on a Tuesday afternoon to join this talk. And I'm just going to say a few words to open up the session and introduce our speaker. But you know, I'm Wasim. I'm a research fellow with CID, and my background is in development finance. I spent 5 years working at British International Investment, where I actually fell in love with this sector. You know, I think it's a real sweet spot between pure public sector work and pure private sector work. You know, it's about supporting and developing the private sector, but using public sector money. And you know, because I enjoy that sweet spot so much, it's been my mission in a way to try and kind of spread the word about it, right? And so over the last 6 months, I've tried to bring in some of the key people in the industry from some of the key organisations in the industry, and one of those people is Lori Kerr, who is CEO of FinDev Canada, and FinDev Canada is one of the newest development finance institutions. They were set up by Canada only around 6-7 years ago, and what that shows you that this field is growing and it's evolving and it's exciting. And so really the way we're going to structure this session is it's going to be somewhat semi-formal. So Laurie's going to cover a few topics about her career, about FinDev Canada, about the state of development finance at the moment. But along the way, if you have questions, feel free to ask at certain points. I'll regulate the amount of questions we have to make sure this, we can continue the conversation. And then afterwards, at 5 p.m, we're going to migrate for casual drinks and discussion at the Grafton. Okay, good. All right, look, and just to get started, let me introduce you to Lori Kerr, CEO of FinDev Canada, who's been in this field for several decades now and has a wealth of experience. And Lori, just want to open it up to you to introduce yourself, your background, and start from there.
So first, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really great to be here. I was telling Wasim earlier, it's wonderful to be back on a campus. I taught at Georgetown when I was in DC for 15 years. And so it's so great just to be back and surrounded by students. So it's great to be here. And thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules. I would imagine this is sort of coming up to a very busy time of the year. So thanks for being here. So would it be helpful if I started with a little bit about FinDev Canada and then talk about my background, or do you want me to talk about my background first? How would you?
I would say let's start with your kind of career journey from the start, because you've worked in some big kind of names in the development finance world, and it would be great to start with that, and then we can lead up to FinDev Canada.
Brilliant. Okay, all right. So not sure how far back in history to go, but so I did my undergraduate degree in political science and economics at the University of Western Ontario, now renamed Western University, and then I did what started out as a master's in Latin American studies at the Center for Research in Latin America and the Caribbean at York University, just north of Toronto. And when I was about a year into that program, it just didn't feel right. All of my colleagues were like, you're a little too business for this program. And I'm like, oh, gee, I don't really fit here. And so then I thought about doing an MBA, and I was like, well, I don't really know. And then the Schulich School of Business at the time had an international MBA program, and you had to work in another country. And so I decided, well, let me give this a shot. So I flipped my master's degree into a graduate diploma and went and did my international MBA at the Schulich School at York University. As part of that program, you had to do an internship. So I liked the banking side of things. I wanted to work in emerging markets, so I went and worked for the Royal Bank of Canada in Argentina, which was great, except that I was in a developing region and I was doing absolutely nothing for the developing country that I was in. I was working with Volkswagen and Cargill and what have you, and I was like, well, this isn't really what I want to do either. I like the banking, I like the finance side, but I need more. So I was really searching for what I call investment banking with heart, way before impact investing became a thing. And so I learned about the multilateral development banks, and I thought, well, let me try this on for size. And so took a bus down to Washington, D.C. and looked through an old-fashioned directory, nothing online at the time, got a whole bunch of interviews, and I was lucky to have several job offers, including from the Inter-American Development Bank. And the Inter-American Development Bank is the regional multilateral that deals only with Latin America and the Caribbean. And at the time, so this was in the mid-90s, and so at the time, the IDB proper was doing like World Bank work, right? They were doing sovereign lending and policy advice and what have you. And at that time, they were advising Latin American governments with the waves of privatization in infrastructure. And they realized, well, there was no mechanism to actually finance the concessionaires that come out of all of this great work we're doing with governments. And so Japan came in with a sizable capital increase and started what at the time was called the private sector department. So I think I was number, 30 in the private sector department at the time. And it was a really wonderful and amazing experience to be there, kind of really developing a department. I was brand new, sort of, fresh out of school with a little bit of experience, financing infrastructure. And it was really a transformative time because unlike perhaps bigger institutions where I would have sat in a cubicle and done financial models for the first 3 years, day one, I was sort of stuffed in front of a client and like trying to figure out how to do all of this stuff. So it was a really wonderful, wonderful training ground and learning ground. I had lots of opportunities within IDB. I stayed there almost 20 years, and the private sector department grew into the structured and corporate finance department. And then in 2015, 2016, there was a merger with a sister organization called the Inter-American Investment Corporation, and thus what is now IDB Invest was birthed. And so after about 20 years, I decided I love Latin America. It's in my heart. It's in my soul. But I really wanted to work in other emerging markets. So I left at that time and started working with a colleague. We actually started a consulting firm. Worked with that for a couple of years, and then decided to join the World Bank Group, which, to my surprise, I have a colleague from here, which was completely out of context when I saw to his face. I couldn't believe it. In any case, so we were colleagues back then. So spent a wonderful 3.5 years at the World Bank Group as well, working on private infrastructure finance. So at IDB, I was working all in private infrastructure finance. So primarily in energy. Back in the day, before we knew green, it was oil and gas and offshore welling in the Campos Basin in Brazil and what have you. But then I found green, then I found climate, and sort of have never left that space since then. So always really focused on the infrastructure side of things in renewable energies, then started to get into climate finance and blended finance when that was first starting. And then did consulting, as I said, still around blended finance and climate finance, and then joined the World Bank Group where I continued to work on infrastructure finance, supporting a trust fund, the global infrastructure facility that supports emerging market governments in developing the proverbial pipelines of bankable infrastructure projects. So spent some time there as well, and then I've been at FinDev Canada for 3.5 years.
And how did that transition come about? Because it also involved you moving back to Canada after many years away. Did they approach you for the role? Did you approach them? What was that process like, and what excited you about?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, when I was at the IDB was when FinDev Canada started the idea of what this development finance institution was, and the executive director at the time sort of hauled me in with a few other Canadians in the organization to talk about what this animal could be. Fast forward 5 years, had a few conversations, and then fast forward, and a headhunter approached me and said, "You're a Canadian and you've got the profile. Would you come?" And I was like, "Heck yeah!" So it was essentially that. I mean, I had to go through a rigorous interview process and what have you, but the opportunity to do the work that I deeply care about, I'm deeply passionate about, I just love to do it for my own country is like a dream come true. Like, I have found my people, I have found my life's work. I couldn't be happier. So it was kind of a no-brainer when the opportunity came up.
Fantastic. And then with double clicking on FinDev Canada, they are I think one of the newest DFIs. I think the only other DFI that I can think of that's been set up in recent time, or two, is AIIB, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That's multilateral, and the new BRICS New Development Bank. But I think you said that FinDev Canada was the only DFI set up by a G7 country in recent times. Could you tell us a bit more about what led Canada to set up their own DFI, And then when you came to the helm of it, what did you find in that organization? And, what has your journey with them been like?
Yeah. So indeed, so FinDev Canada was established in 2018, the last G7 country to stand up a DFI. The idea of putting together a DFI had sort of been within Canadian government thinking for actually about a decade before it was set up. And in the sort of a prior regime of Canadian development, there was our Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and we had CETA, the Canadian International Development Agency, which is sort of equivalent to the USAID construct in the US. And then around 2015, there was a big reorganization, CETA, and what came out of that, CETA was sort of well, you have probably a better way of saying it, but CETA was sort of absorbed into a new department called Global Affairs Canada. And within that, there's sort of like the diplomatic corps, there's the development corps, and there's the trade corps. So the three-headed animal, which is now Global Affairs Canada. So within that kind of context, the idea of like, okay, so we've got sort of, we still have that aid, that more traditional sort of aid bent, but really we don't have development finance. So it was actually in Canada, there's sort of two main political parties, there's the Conservatives and the Liberals, there's others, but and at the time, Stephen Harper under the Conservative administration really put forward the idea of creating FinDev Canada. It was implemented by the Liberals under Trudeau, and that's how we've grown over the last since 2018, since we were established. So we kind of have bipartisan support, if you're familiar with kind of that terminology, sort of thought of, created by the Conservatives, but then implemented by the Liberals. And so when I came into, so think about it. So FinDev Canada was really like established in 2018, had about a year of getting the plumbing together, figuring out how to do stuff, about a year transacting, and then COVID hit. And so here's this brand new young organization, which it could have been easy, like, well, that was a nice idea, but it's COVID. The team did a really great job. It was before I got there. The team did an extraordinary job of keeping the ship afloat. We were landlocked in Canada. I mean, everybody was landlocked wherever they were. We were landlocked in Canada. No overseas offices, barely kind of a reputation because we had just started. So the team really worked with the European DFIs. So if you're familiar with the EGFIs, but a series of European DFIs who were just wonderful partners, continue to be wonderful partners, shared their pipeline, really brought us into the mix. And that's how we really got sort of our ground underneath us from those early days.
And just for context, the European DFIs, they're a close-knit community of bilateral DFIs. They have an association called EDFI, which brings them together to collaborate on various topics. And I think since Canada set up their DFI, like the Canadian DFI FinDev Canada has been brought into the fold as well with that group, and it's a wonderful community of DFIs.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, the last meeting last fall, both DFC and FinDev Canada became associate members.
And so then you came to FinDev Canada. Do you think you were quite well positioned, given that you'd been in the early stages of IDB Invest and you saw the build of that? And then, what's your journey been like with FinDev Canada whilst you've been at the helm?
So I feel, and I guess I was very well positioned for the role for a couple of reasons. One is that there traditionally hadn't been a big development finance bench in Canada because we didn't have a DFI, right? So having grown up in the multilateral development bank system, that really prepared me. Like, I know development finance through and through, development finance with the private sector sort of through and through. It's what I eat and sleep and breathe and bleed. So I was well positioned from that perspective, being on the investment side as well, right? So knowing about making financially sustainable investments and about impact. But I think one of the other things that really prepared me, and as you're thinking about sort of your own career, is I took a couple of lateral moves and really got out of my comfort space. I could have just been like a banker for 30 years, but I didn't. Partway through, I took an opportunity to lead a corporate area of what ended up being IDB Invest. I mean, human resources, communications, things that, like, I'm a banker, what do I know about that stuff? But I was given that wonderful opportunity. And I think if I didn't have that sort of corporate opportunity, I wouldn't be as well positioned to lead an organization without having both the business side as well as really kind of the corporate side. So when I came into FinDev Canada, I've always had an entrepreneurial spirit, like even creating opportunities and new programs and pushing the envelope. And I was afforded that opportunity to do a lot of wonderful things at the IDB, but that entrepreneurial spirit and that formative work of working in an organization or a department that was really growing set me up really well for FinDev Canada. So when I came in, we were about, so 3.5 years ago, we were, I think, 35 people. We had about $230 million on our balance sheet. And today we're about 135 people, and we have over $1.5 billion on our balance sheet. So we've grown a lot. We've got several capital increases, so equity contributions from the Canadian government, as well as a large concessional finance facility that was announced at the G7 last year, and some technical assistance. So we're really well positioned.
Fantastic. And for some of you who took my seminar last semester, my kind of model for breaking down a DFI is to think about it in terms of an investment vertical, an impact vertical, and then the corporate center. And according to that framework, can you kind of describe the investment activities and the products and geographies that FinDev does, and then its impact priorities and the teams that sit there?
Sure thing. So just sort of broad view. So what do we do as a DFI? So we support development through the private sector. How do we do that? What do we deploy? So we provide financing, so debt, so financing and investment, equity, blended finance solutions, as well as technical assistance and advisory to support sustainable, inclusive growth only in emerging markets and developing economies. We are a Canadian institution, so we're a public policy mechanism of the Government of Canada in its development and development finance toolkit, but we are not required to have a Canadian connection. So if you're familiar with export credit agencies, they exist to support domestic exports. So in our case, Export Development Canada has to have that Canadian connection. I do not. I'm about supporting development outcomes in the markets that we serve. So we provide financing, investment, blended finance, and technical assistance and advisory. We work in 3 geographies. When we were first created, we worked in Latin America and the Caribbean and Sub-Saharan Africa. We're small. We couldn't be everything to every market. So those were the geographies that were selected. And then last year, our mandate was expanded. We got a capital increase. Our mandate was expanded to expand into double down what we're doing in Latin America, as well as in Africa, and expand into the Indo-Pacific region, as Canada itself put forth sort of a national Indo-Pacific strategy to be a more reliable and credible partner in the region. So 3 geographies. As a development finance institution, as a financial institution, I have to become financially self-sustaining. So we are about market-led solutions. We're about market-oriented return. So if I provide a loan, I need to get repaid. If I make an equity investment, I need a return on that investment. It's not soft money. It's commercially oriented money. Okay. So as a financial institution, that's critical, because I can't keep going back to the Canadian government ad infinitum to be like, I need more capital, I need more capital, I need more capital. I got to kind of stand on my own 2 feet. So that construct is really important. However, it's not sufficient. So in addition to making sure that I can get repaid or make a return, I have to provide development outcomes. And for FinDev Canada, the 3 impact lenses through which we look when we make our capital allocation decisions are climate and nature action. So how are we having a positive contribution to climate change on mitigation, as well as adaptation, resilience, and nature? So climate and nature action. The second lens is market development. So how are we contributing to good jobs, longevity of jobs, our local capital markets development, for example? So how are we contributing to local markets? And the third is gender equality and women's economic empowerment. So how are we harnessing the power of half the population that has traditionally been excluded into development outcomes? So again, when we're making our investment and our financing decisions, we have a rigorous development impact framework that we essentially look through, plot what outcomes do we think we're going to have, inputs, outputs, outcomes, what we think we're going to have along those three impact goals. So again, financial sustainability is required, but it's not sufficient. I have to have development.
Yeah, interesting. And just to put like a bit, make it a bit more tangible, what teams sit under that to support the delivery of both the investment side, the impact side, but then also more broadly, what sits around the corporate centre as well?
Okay, so what I didn't talk about is sort of the sectors that we operate through, and this is how our teams are organized. So we have 3 sectors, if you will. So the first sector that we support is the financial industry. So we work. So what does that mean? That's our intermediated business, and that means that we work with local and regional banks, non-bank financial institutions, and private equity. So we have a team that does basically bank lending and a team that does private equity. So that's how the deal-facing teams are organized. We have a second sector called agribusiness and forestry, and their value chain. So everything from seed to supermarket and everything in between. So we have a team that has ag and forestry expertise. And then the third sector team, if you will, is sustainable infrastructure. And for FinDev Canada, that means basic economic infrastructure. So energy, transport, water and sanitation, and digital connectivity. We don't yet support social infrastructure, housing, health, education. Again, we just can't be everything to everyone. So we're focusing now on economic infrastructure. So those are the deal team leads, if you will. So the sector teams are kind of the bankers in the house, right? So that's the investment officers that actually structure the deal, but they're not alone. They're surrounded by an integrated deal team. So we have other members of the team in another vertical are our impact team. And the impact team looks through those impact lenses that I was talking about. So they're the people that really look and be like, okay, we're lending to a bank. What kind of outcomes are we going to have? So they run the tool and think about the development impact of a transaction. We have an environmental and social team that not just does environmental and social from a compliance perspective and a risk perspective, but also looks for opportunities for positive contribution. We have a climate risk team as well that is part of the deal team. So that's one vertical, sort of an impact. And then the next section of the team, we have our lawyers. Always have to have the lawyers. So we have lawyers that work that work as an integrated part of the team. And then we have a team on business integrity, and that's really the financial crimes, the governance, all of those types of things, the business integrity team. So that machination of people. So there's an investment officer, the business, an impact officer, the development impact, environmental and social officer, climate officer, and business integrity and lawyer. So 5 people kind of conform what we call a project team or a transaction team. And depending on opportunities, there might be somebody from the technical assistance facility that says, hey, how can I support? How can we provide some technical assistance to help this client on their journey related to E&S or gender or data collection or what have you. So we have a kind of a menu of things that we support clients from the technical assistance. So we've got that sort of core team of deal-facing people. And that's really what drives the business. That's the engine of our business. And then we've got a risk management function, really important. Keep the investment people, honest. Then we have a strategy and communications team and government relations team as well. And then we have a finance team that does our, financial statements and projections and all of that kind of stuff. So those are kind of the verticals that we have. Within the investment team, we also have a blended finance and mobilization team. And I can talk a little bit more about blended finance if people are interested in that. But that's another sort of part of the investment. But that they're only leveraged when it's a blended finance transaction, not just when it's our own balance sheet that we're bringing to the fore. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
One of the things that I thoroughly enjoyed about being at British International Investment was the fact that it was a small, fast-growing organisation. So in the time that I was there, we tripled in headcount from about 200 to 600 people, and that growth is exciting. And it also, and that growth within the context of a small organisation also means there's huge opportunities to kind of like get senior level exposure, which I was fortunate to have. What trajectory is FinDev Canada on as well? What's in store for FinDev Canada? I mean, is FinDev Canada kind of a ray of light, in this kind of like darkness we're facing in the development industry at the moment?
So I would like to think we're definitely a ray of light for a few different reasons. One is that we don't have any capital constraints. So if you know about sort of the multilaterals or the development finance institutions, there's a lot of talk in the ecosystem around capital constraints and how can they leverage their balance sheets better. Because we're a young and growing organization, I don't have those capital constraints, so I can kind of unleash the power of my balance sheet, if you will. So that's a really great position to be in. The government has also very generously given us this $700 million concessional finance facility and $20 million in technical assistance. So my toolkit of debt, equity, blended finance, TA, it's robust, and it's like I'm in deployment mode. So that is super, super exciting. So I guess that's kind of what's in store for us. We have plans to grow. As I mentioned when I started 3 and some odd years ago, we were 35, we're at 135 now. We're going to continue to add capacity over the course of the next years to make sure that we can continue to deploy the resources as well. Very importantly, once we deploy the resources, we don't say, well, that's great. We actually have a robust portfolio management unit that does the monitoring of any of those investments or financing, whether it's a 2-year life, 5-year life, a 20-year life in the case of infrastructure. They stick with the portfolio over time. So, and we keep adding to the portfolio every year with our approval. So that team will also grow. So we're definitely in growth mode as an organization. And again, grateful for all the capital that we have, that we're in deployment mode.
And just to kind of like try and tackle the kind of elephant in the room, which is what's happening in the development space at the moment, which is, you know, I think you said this earlier, it's the biggest disruption you've ever seen in your career. Can you kind of talk a bit more about, you know, your views of what's happening in the world of international development, how that will kind of impact development finance, both at the multilateral level and the bilateral level? And, you know, will there be any spillover effects, you know, that might affect you guys in Canada as well? And I think it would be, you know, be really insightful for the students to kind of understand from, you know, you as an industry, you know, Grundy, like your perspective on that.
Yeah, I would be happy to. And so, first of all, I don't speak for the Canadian government, so I need to say that. And sort of the views I represent are only my own. But I think that sort of what I see now, and as I've shared with my own team, is that, you know, we've been through, you know, at least in sort of the 25, 30 years that I've been in this business, there's been, you know, different financial crises. There's been the GFC, there's been COVID, there's been disruption, but for me, this is really like tectonic plates are moving, right? Like whatever position one might have on what's happening in the US, the fact of the matter is that USAID is a third of what we want, a third. That is, those are big shoes to fill. So that's incredibly disruptive to the sort of the aid architecture globally. But aid is aid, right? We're in a different space. We're not in the sort of that humanitarian space. We're not, which is a very valid part of government toolkits writ large, right? But there's the sort of the humanitarian and the aid space. Then there's the development finance space, and FinDev Canada sits in the development finance space, much like, you know, FMO or DEG in Germany or BII in the UK and what have you. So we're not in that part of the spectrum. However, depending on how any government does their budgeting, the impacts of scaling back ODA for various reasons could impact DFIs going forward, could impact contributions to multilateral development banks going forward. So it is hugely disruptive. I guess what I would say in terms of what could the potential impacts of this be in sort of the broader architecture, if you will. So what I would start with is, so we're in like-minded peers, we're in the business of supporting development through the private sector, right? We're providing market-based solutions. To the extent that there is more market volatility, private investment, particularly foreign investment, retreats from emerging markets in a flight to safety. I don't know where those safe havens are these days, but anyways, that's sort of like the theory, right? Like private investment wants to get out of the riskier markets in search of safer markets. When inflation is rising, interest rates are getting out of hand, et cetera, et cetera. So as those things unfold, as time goes forward, this whole sort of ethos of development finance for the last like 15 to 20 years is really changed. What do I mean by that? So since I got into the industry, and I'm going to grossly overgeneralize here, but just for the sake of an illustration, in general, certainly not in every single emerging market and developing economy, but in general, over the last 20 years, except for COVID, it's been direction of travel of growth, right? Of economic growth and prosperity. Again, not every country, not all at the same time, and there's been backtracking and what have you, but and generally it's been going like this. And so with that, the idea, and especially when there's a very low interest rate environment in developed markets, investors are looking for yield. They're looking for productive investment. So then they're like, oh, emerging markets, let's go to emerging markets. So there was this whole sort of thrust in the last 20 years of private capital mobilization. I'm sure you've heard that. Mobilizing private capital, we got to get more private capital into emerging markets for very good reasons, right? Since 2015, since the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, like we have an investment gap in emerging markets of upwards of $4 trillion a year to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We're completely off track of that, right? So the investment gap is huge, and public budgets absolutely cannot fill that. So private sector, how do we mobilize more private sector? So generally this trajectory. But as we move forward and there is this like disruption and volatility in markets, private sector is in general going to be less interested in emerging markets as they go and try and find safer havens to invest in. So what does that mean? I think for development finance, whether it's a multilateral, whether it's a bilateral, I think it's almost a really interesting inflection point, if you will. Because if you go back to kind of the very beginning of what are MDBs and DFIs all about, it's about counter-cyclical support, right? So actually when markets tank and times are difficult, that's actually when MDBs and DFIs should be investing more, right? We're there to help stabilize capital flow, stabilize investment. When the pendulum shifts back, we can say we were there for the last 5 years and we haven't lost our shirt. So private sector can come back in, but that counter-cyclical nature hasn't really been exercised. It's a formational muscle, but we haven't really exercised it in the last 10 or 15, maybe even 20 years, because it's all been about PCM, which is a good thing. But I think we're going to kind of get back to our roots. And my sense, and I do not have a crystal ball, my sense is a couple of things. One is that we're going to see a lot more what we call own account lending, right? So which means that the MDBs and DFIs, there's going to be a lot of our own balance sheet that's being leveraged, right? And maybe not as much private capital mobilization, because again, we're there to stabilize capital flows, we're there to stabilize markets. But in addition to that, I think that there's going to be more pressure for those investors that may be willing to be venturous, the pressure to use that precious private capital to actually keep foreign investment in market. There's going to be a lot more pressure on that. So it's going to be a very different, my perception is that it's going to be a little bit of a different algebra that's going to happen going forward. Again, going back to the roots of, wow, now we're going to have to flex that muscle of being counter-cyclical, which is very different necessarily than private capital mobilization. So I think it'll be really interesting how the dialogue in the international financial architecture evolves because of that, because we haven't been tested in this way as a group in the way that I expect or I would anticipate will be tested going forward.
And I have one more question that's career related, okay, to the fact that we're a public policy school, not a business school, and then we'll open it up to questions. I know we have a couple of questions online. I think there's been a perception, at least in the past, and I think in the past it's certainly true, that to get into development finance organization, you need to be a finance person, right? And I'm wondering to what extent is that statement true or false? And what roles are there within FinDev Canada for people who graduate from public policy school?
Yeah, okay, so let me start bigger picture and then I'll talk about FinDev Canada. So I think just talking about development finance, it's way too general, right? There's a lot of different aspects of development finance. And let me just use an easy example. You've got the World Bank, right? So part of the World Bank, like they do policy-based lending and investment lending with sovereigns. You don't need to be a banker to do that, right? Like, I'm not saying that they're not technical people, but sovereign lending is not structured finance, right? There's interesting things about thematic bonds and stuff like that, but general lending. So there's tons of opportunities if you're interested in sort of public sector operations, if you will, that you don't have to be a banker for. I mean, there's economists, there's impact people. I mean, there's sector experts. So there's lots and lots of opportunities. That is very different than working in sort of like the IFC part of the World Bank or the MEGA part of the World Bank, where again, the teams are led by investment officers that have finance experience. But even I told you, look, our deal team, we've got at least 5 people on a deal team. The investment person is one of them. Well, maybe there's an investment person and an analyst, but there's the impact people, there's the climate people, there's the ENS people, there's the business integrity and governance people. Like there's lawyers, there's a lot of people that can form a project team. An investment officer can't do it alone in, I would say, all of the MDBs and the DFIs. So when you talk about development finance, there's a lot of different aspects of development finance. We're just one piece of it. IFC is one piece of it. FMO is one piece. BI is one piece of it. But there's, like in France, there's AFD. That's a development institution, but they deal mostly with sovereign, right? There's EFAD. There's a lot of the International Food and Agriculture Organization. There's UN agencies. There's a lot in development finance that isn't banking. So huge opportunities, I would say.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Well, look, let's open it up to questions, and we can just continue with the discussion on a question basis. Yep, go ahead.
Okay,
and say your name and
sure.
brief statement of what program you're doing as well.
Frank Becerra, MCMPA. So I'm also a fellow Canadian, and congratulations, it's a wonderful fund, and looks like you do a wonderful job. And so I have a couple questions. The first question is, I mean, when the fund started up under the Harper government, and then when the Trudeau government came in, you mentioned that they implemented what the Harper government had suggested. Has the mandate changed between those governments for FinDev?
No. So the actual, and don't quote me on this, but the actual mandate of FinDev Canada is to, and I should know this off by heart, and this is terrible that I don't. But anyways, but it's quite broad. It's supporting. Supporting private sector financing and investment in a way that's consistent with Canada's international assistance priorities. So it's very big. So we have a strategy that we agree both with our board of directors as well as with the government of Canada on a 5-year rolling basis about how we're actually going to implement that. So when I came in, I evolved the strategy from the version 1 strategy, since we were coming out of COVID and I was new and what have you. So we have evolved the strategy, but it's still entirely consistent with the mandate.
Okay. And do you see that evolving further with, like, I don't know if the Conservatives are going to win or the Liberals are going to stay in party, because now Carney is the Prime Minister, so it might be him or Poilievre, so we don't know.
Indeed.
And does that keep you on walking on eggshells a little bit, or not?
So not walking on eggshells. I mean, we are a public policy mechanism of the government of Canada, so our mandate is to serve the policy directions of the government of Canada. So we'll have to wait and see. I don't have a crystal ball.
Because their strategies are different, both Poilievre and also Carney.
So indeed, but there hasn't been a lot of public discourse on what those priorities are, right? There's been a few snippets in the press, but we don't yet know what any particular policy direction would be.
I can give you a bit of an example from the UK, because I think the government's relationship with the UK government at BII is similar. We, generally speaking, both sides are very supportive of development finance as an idea, as a policy tool. Where there've been changes, have been I'd say relatively minor. So, for example, we basically we're focusing on Africa and South Asia. When DFID got merged with FCDO, there's more of a desire to align it with foreign policy objectives. So our mandate expanded to include Southeast Asia, but we still remain well capitalized, and there's no sign that the Labour government's gonna change anything that BII has been doing. So that's been good for us.
Indeed, we've seen an example with FMO, with the Dutch. They recently came up with policy directive, little p policy directive, I'm not sure what the precise construct is, but there needs to be a Dutch connection now with FMO financing. So again, heretofore we don't have that, but again, we're all public policy mechanisms of our governments.
It's quite interesting because US DFC was OPIC, which had to have a US connection.
And then
It's,
that was broken
if you
down.
and then it was under the Trump administration that US OPIC became US DFC, and actually was surprisingly unleashed.
And one last question.
Yeah.
Your market returns, are they similar to the Business Development Bank of Canada, the Export Development Corporation of Canada, or how would you compare your returns compared to some other metric?
Yeah. So I can't compare to BDC because BDC does like domestic financing within Canada, right? And EDC is in a different business than we are supporting Canadian exports. But what I can say is that we as an organization need to be financially self-sustaining, so we're on that trajectory. When we do our pricing of our transactions, we do benchmarking within either the what has the client done before? Have they raised debt before? What was it priced? What was the timing? What were market conditions? Have similarly situated companies raised debt at what price? And similarly situated countries, what's the sovereign? What are similarly situated organizations in neighboring countries with similar circumstances? So we do that benchmarking so that we come up with what a range would be, and we truth test it with the private sector. Again, we always try and bring in some sort of private investment. So we'll go to a bank or, depending on whatever would make sense, whether that's to go to an asset manager and say, hey, would you invest in this project, co-invest with us at these terms and conditions? So we try and truth test that, because what we don't want to do, which the DFI community doesn't want to do in dealing with the private sector, is distort markets, right?
Do you often have to?
We'll have to.
Sorry to interrupt this exchange, which I think is very interesting. I maybe kind of relatedly or talking about strategy and how it changed when you came in. I mean, one of the advantages of being the last G7 country to build a DFI is you get to learn from all the others. And so, I mean, I guess just generally speaking, when you came in 2018 and you were thinking about forming a strategy, what do you want to do differently, or what do you think distinguishes FinDev from how everyone else operates in these similar geographies?
Yeah, great question. So thank you. So I came in 2020. We were established in 2018, and then I came in sort of mid 2021. And so, and we're coming out of COVID, right? Because what happened with FinDev Canada, as well as with sort of everybody else at the time, there was a real uptake in the intermediated business because nobody could travel, nobody could do due diligence. But what everybody was doing was lending and investing in local banks or private equity to get liquidity to where it needed to be because nobody could travel. So we had a huge amount of intermediated business when I came in, but also so did IFC and everyone else. So fine. So when I came in, we were coming out of COVID, and it's like, okay, let's reset. Like we need to look back so we can look forward. What's going on in the world? So when we looked at what was going on in the world, climate was, the climate crisis was absolutely exacerbated. Development gains had been sort of backtracking because of COVID across emerging markets and developing economies, again, to different ways. The food crisis, food security really started to become emerging as a key issue, and we're behind on the SDGs. And so with all of those, I put all those in the mixing pot, and I'm like, you know what? The impact goals that we had, at the time it was climate action, not climate in nature, but climate, local market development, and gender, it holds. It holds even in this post-COVID environment. So our impact goals were right? Or we validated them, like that still holds. But when I came in, it was, we need to do more than intermediated business. FinDev Canada was not set up only to do intermediated business, but that was what the market needed at the time. So let's really think about where are the sectors where we can add value. So again, we'll continue intermediated business. Everybody does it. It's good. Then ag and forestry. Again, ag because of food security, and then infrastructure, particularly because of climate and just the connection. All of the SDGs, in some way, shape, or form, all relate back to infrastructure, essentially. So those were the three sectors that we've essentially focused on. And how are we differentiating ourselves? Because again, if I shared that with you, you're like, well, that sounds a little bit like BII.
How are you
That
better?
sounds like a little
Question
bit
is,
like
how are you better than
exactly. It sounds a
BII?
little bit like I
You can pick the French or someone else who's not.
so how are we different? And how I would say, like, how we're different is along the lines of the following. Like, I grew up in amazing multilateral development banks, and so I'm taking all of those lessons learned, and I'm creating an organization and instilling sort of an ethos in the organization of limited bureaucracy. We can do great things. We can be entirely client centric. You will not wait for us. Like if you're a client, we will not be the last financing party over the finish line. Like we will be straightforward. We're not going to take you down a garden path for a year and then say no. We will be supportive. We will not just respond to need. We will not just like respond to needs. We'll actually anticipate needs. We will be dynamic. We will be agile. And this is sort of the mentality. Everybody has great ideas, so don't be shy. Is there an opportunity? Let's see how we could sort of explore that opportunity. It might not be tomorrow. Maybe it's next week. Maybe we put it in the parking lot, but everybody's got a hand in building the organization, which is amazing because we're small. We're like 130 people, right? So everybody has an opportunity to contribute. Everybody has fabulous ideas, and we're entirely client-centric with very little bureaucracy. So that's how we differentiate ourselves, quite honestly.
Go with it.
Great. So 2 questions. You can answer which one you wish. So what do you think is an emerging trend or sector that may be overlooked nowadays that you think will be critical in the next decade? The other question is, a lot of people are talking about AI. So what do you think may be the role of AI in transforming finance and decision making? What are some of the opportunities and the risks as well?
Yeah, wow, those are both really good questions. So where I see sort of the MDB DFI community, we've always been in the infrastructure space where I think that there needs to be more creative solutions is in ag because of food security and in healthcare, right? Because of climate, there's going to be lots more issues in both of those sectors. So figuring out how to bring in more private investment in those, there's going to be there's absolutely going to be public investment that's required, and that's okay. But how do we bring in more private investment? I would say in those two sectors. I would say with AI, I mean, we're already seeing sort of the transformations that's happening with AI, where we come into that or supporting, like, could be just supporting the data centers on the infrastructure side, right? So can it be leveraged? So can AI be leveraged? Yes, absolutely. I think we're very, very incipient in terms of harnessing the opportunity there. And I'll just like take our own example of FinDev Canada by using, Copilot, as a matter of fact. I mean, we have a closed loop. We've put in all of our impact, I'm simplifying, but we've kind of put in all of our impact data. After we got all the security clearances, we put in all of our impact data. And the amount of time it took, and my numbers are not right, so don't quote me here, but it was something like, it went down from like an hour to 9 minutes because of it could compute and it could put everything. Amazing. Like, think of the time savings of that, right? So for me, that's basic data analysis. That's basic data, not even data analysis. It's like the data input, right? But think that 43 minutes, whatever that's been, that math was not right. The 51 minutes, what did I say? 9 minutes, the 51 minutes. That imagine that 51 minutes can go into productive analysis, not data input. Like, wow, that's pretty awesome. And that's just me and my little microcosm, right? Just with some, impact data. So applying AI, in the infrastructure space, blockchain for financial transactions, like yes, yes, and yes, and yes. And there's a lot of smarter people out there than me that are actually know a lot more about that than myself, for sure. But how we're implementing it is to make us more efficient and effective as an organization. And that on the infrastructure side, it would be through supporting data centers. We haven't done that to date, but that's certainly big in the Indo-Pacific region where we've just expanded into.
Name and program?
Yeah, so Miguel Rosso, MCMPA, and as I told you, I used to work at Global Affairs Canada and also the Global Environment Facility of the World Bank, so very relevant.
My name is Jimin Im. I'm a first-year student here at the International Development Program. So I'm from South Korea, and we're actually starting a discussion in establishing our own DFI.
Indeed you are.
Yes. So we're very much interested in how this conversation first began. And you have mentioned that you have chosen priority sectors and regions. I was wondering how those sectors were determined, and also I think that independence from the government is like a key part of being a DFI. I was wondering if there are any tools or ways in which FinDev has been able to ensure this.
Yeah, so so I've had the great pleasure of talking to Kexim for the last probably 2 or 3 years since the idea of putting a DFI up, and the idea is that maybe it'll be some, because we're actually a subsidiary of Export Development Canada. So Kexim is thinking about the same thing, the government is thinking about the same thing. So anyway, so I had a number of conversations talking about our governance and how we sort of came to the fore. I'm very happy to continue those conversations to share our experience. Where shall I start? So maybe I'll start with governance, the last, and work backwards. So from a governance perspective, so in Canada, there's this construct called a crown corporation. And what that means is we are managed independently. We're arm's length from the government. We have an independent, the government doesn't sit directly on the board. So my board at FinDev Canada, since I'm a subsidiary of Export Development Canada, our subsidiary governance framework has it that half of my board, the majority of my board, so half of my board plus the chair of my board is from Export Development Canada. Export Development Canada's board of directors is appointed by the government of Canada. They go through like a council appointment. So EDC basically selects the board members, half the board members to sit, and then the other half of my board are independent board members, right? And these are folks that are that come from the development or the development finance space. So who are my independent directors? Just as an example, one is Elsbetta Klein, who used to be the global climate business director at the IFC. She retired. She's now the CEO of the International Fertilizer Association, deep bench in climate finance and MDB. She's on my board. Former Canadian executive director at a couple of different multilateral development banks, and a Canadian diplomat, Ambassador Guillermo Brzezinski. He's on my board. Albert Eisen, an African banker. He's on my board. So I've got half of my board that's really drawn from independent board members that have expertise. How I do relate from a governance perspective with the government is that I do I have a 5-year corporate plan that's updated annually. So it's a 5-year rolling period. And after my board approves it, after EDC's board approve it, the government of Canada approves it. So they actually approve my budget and my corporate plan, and my day-to-day reporting relationship is into the Minister of International Development. So those are my kind of like day-to-day conversations. So when I talk about strategy, I really talk to that vertical about it, but the government does approve my corporate plan. And then every so often, again, in the Canadian construct, there's a statement of priorities and accountabilities that can be issued by a presiding minister, broadly outlining what we should focus on. So if the government wanted us to focus on mining, for example, they could say, hey, we want FinDev Canada to focus on mining. And then that's how that would sort of come. But we have a very open dialogue with global affairs, and the governance is very well respected. Okay.
Hannah, then yourself, and then Shrila. Is that Hannah?
Hi, Lori. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Hannah. I'm an MPA student here, also a Canadian. So I wanted to double click on what you said about DFIs being sort of a part of the foreign policy toolkit. For the US DFC, at least, I feel like the sort of unspoken raison d'etre is like to counter the influence of China abroad. And so just curious to hear from you, like, what are the strategic priorities of Canada as it relates to how FinDev and where FinDev plays? How does it sort of justify itself to the Canadian public? And also sort of a related question is, like, have you ever seen any kind of trade-offs between political conditionality and, sending money where it's needed the most?
Yeah. So where do I start with this? So again, the government of Canada respects sort of the Crown Corporation construct, and so we do have that independent authority from the government, but we do have that, again, we do report into them, they approve the corporate plan, they approve our strategic direction. So when I was doing the strategy refresh a few years ago, there was good dialogue with them about, hey, these impact goals, they still make sense. When we were first created, again, it was $300 million in capital. At the time, the government said, there was a conversation, you can't serve the entire developing world. So at the time, Latin America and the Caribbean and Sub-Saharan Africa were policy priorities for the Canadian government. So that's where FinDev Canada started. About 18 months, 2 years ago, Canada as a country put forth an Indo-Pacific strategy, as I mentioned, and as part of that, they flexed the tool of FinDev Canada in that toolkit, gave us a capital increase to do more in our current markets and expand into the Indo-Pacific. So that's how they sort of, that's how we support Canadian policy directives. Canada said, hey, we want to be in the Indo-Pacific region. We want to be a more credible and reliable partner. There was a bunch of different, there was things around democracy and education, and a bunch of defense and a bunch of different things, and development finance. So we'll give FinDev Canada capital increase to help that piece of, or that tool in the toolkit. So that's how we're very much aligned. What else was in your question?
Yeah, I guess is this sort of a selling speech to the Canadian public, and do you ever see a trade-off between like political?
Yeah, so no, I haven't seen a trade-off, again, because our mandate is to support, Canadian international assistance priorities, and we're well aligned with that given sort of what we do. So like there's no trade-off, because again, we're part of the toolkit that's looking for, commercially sustainable investments with impact. We're not in the grant making space, of the humanitarian space. So we're just a different tool in the toolkit. So we're able to develop that pipeline. We're able to provide those, sort of source those investment opportunities. But no, I don't think that heretofore there's been no trade-off between, having impact and getting our loans repaid.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Let me quickly pose to one question we have from someone online, and they ask, what is the scale of FinDev Canada's work in Africa right now, and what are your future plans in terms of your presence there?
Yeah, so about half, so roughly speaking, we just got the mandate. We've been transacting in Indo-Pacific for a year, so we have about 4 transactions, a couple closed, a couple in the pipeline there. So roughly right now, our portfolio is about half in Latin America and the Caribbean, and about half in Sub-Saharan Africa. So a big size of our portfolio there. Overall, we have about $1.5 billion in investments, so about half that is in Africa. In terms of expanding, so we have office in Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. We opened our first regional office in Singapore 2 weeks ago. So that was super exciting. We have a couple of amazing team members that are based in Singapore. And very recently, Canada actually launched its Africa strategy. And if you look in that, it also talks about FinDev Canada opening an office in Africa. So we'll be on the continent in South Africa before the end of this year as well. So that's our expansion.
And the related question to that is, the political instability challenges, could be particularly acute in Sub-Saharan Africa. And what are the key governance and geopolitical risks that FinDev Canada kind of identifies, if they do identify them proactively, right? And how kind of do these risks kind of play into your investment and impact strategy?
Yeah, so again, we're making private sector financing and investment decisions. So our client is the private sector. Our client is not the government. However, the sovereign environment within which that private sector client is operating, it's obviously impacted by what are the rules, the regulations, the policies, the strength of the institutions, the economics of that particular country. So we do take a look sort of at the client. So at the client level, we'll take a look at the viability of the business plan, basically, and how the impact of that environment within which they're working impacts the viability of that particular investment. So indeed, it's something we take a look at. Even from a legal perspective, we'll look like, can we get money out of the country? Like, are there exchange controls and things like that? So those are also things that we take a look at, which the client has no control over, but it still impacts our ability to get repaid potentially.
And just to add to that, I mean, it's just a fact of doing business in these markets with development finance institutions like at BII. One of the markets we were really excited about was Myanmar, and we actually hired a country rep to help us build a pipeline there, and we made 2 or 3 investments, but then when coup happened, we had to write that off. And so, as part of kind of doing business in the markets that we do business in, and there are tools that we can look at getting as well, like political risk insurance from the MIGA, which is part of the World Bank Group. It's also a key tool that's used in a lot of infrastructure projects. Mm-hmm. So yourself, introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Alvaro. I'm doing a dual degree between the MPA here and also an MBA in Sloan. Thanks you so much, Lori, for your time and for the exciting conversation. So yeah, I come from Chile, so my heart is also in Latin America. I will just give you, ask you a question about how do you see the trends in Latin America, or maybe more specifically, which countries do you think that are more interesting to get some investment right now? And also, how do you see? I mean, now geopolitics is very turmoil and stuff, but it's not only that. Also, we have really high interest rates right now, and inflation is not going down, so interest rate shouldn't be going down in the short term. How does that affect in terms of capital allocation of FinDev Canada, but also like in the rest of the players outside of DeFi institutions?
Yeah, so so there's lots of opportunity in Latin America, right? I mean, I think that it's gone through again, not to generalize, because every country in the region is very individual, but lots of growth. I mean, it's actually a success story. There's certain markets in Latin America that are not ODA, so official development assistance, although they've graduated, like Uruguay and others, that we can actually operate in, which is a success story, right? So we actually so Brazil is a tremendous market. We've got a lot of exposure. We've got exposure in Argentina. We've got exposure in Ecuador, in Peru, in Jamaica, in Jamaica, in the Dominican Republic. So I think there's lots of opportunity there. You know, one of the age-old sort of conversations in development finance is how much resources do you put into middle-income countries versus putting into lower-income countries. And my own sort of personal philosophy is that if we're looking to mobilize private capital is more likely to go in middle-income countries than lower-income countries. And that's okay, right? Because it'll require potentially less public money to support a private investment into middle-income countries than in lower-income countries, and it's a more effective use or more efficient use of the public purse. So long story is that I think there's still huge opportunities despite everything going on globally in Latin America. One of the challenges that we have heretofore is that we don't offer local currency financing yet. We can do things synthetically, and we're looking at some markets, both in Asia as well as in Latin America. But that's where some other entities, they do have an advantage over us because we're not yet offering local currency. So that's something, product development that we have kind of in the pipeline for a few markets as well.
Srila?
I'm Srila. I'm a second-year MPP student here. So my question is more related to the impact side of the work that you do, especially with the kind of changes that you see happening within the US and other countries broadly. And also with this in context that the US has historically chosen the person who heads the World Bank as well. I'm trying to understand how this impacts the work that DFIs are doing at a global scale, and specifically to FinDev Canada as well. One, when we think about gender and also social impact in large.
Yeah. So I don't have a crystal ball, right? But what I can say is that for FinDev Canada, like our impact goals are our impact goals. We have our rigorous and vigorous framework our development impact framework that we use and that we apply to all of our sort of investment decisions. So we're continuing to look through that. I mentioned earlier, I referenced FMO, right? And so FMO, there's been a shift in that now they have to have some sort of Dutch connection. But that doesn't necessarily mean that their impact framework is changing, right? We'll take another one, FinFund, for example. So the Finnish, they had traditionally had a very deep low-income country, LDC, affinity or proclivity. That's gone, right? But that's where their government wants to take them. So I think that depending on what a particular government wants to do, because again, we're all public policy mechanisms. We will need to follow sort of the directives of our government. Where I think to a certain extent, perhaps, because multilateral development banks, be them regional banks or the World Bank Group, there's more than one shareholder, right? So there's going to be discussion amongst the shareholders about where those organizations would go from a philosophical and an impact perspective. Thank you. It's not a perfect answer, I know, but I don't have a crystal ball.
And then we'll
Again, I'm so glad to hear your journey after you left the bank. I was so surprised to meet you. So my question is regarding eligibility to access your financing tools. If I'm not mistaken, you touched upon that unlike the XM, FinDev Canada doesn't care much about the Canada interest in each project. If that's the case, non-Canadian investors can access to your financing. If that's the case, any difference between the financing covered by the other modulator and your financing tool?
Yeah, so you're right. So there doesn't need to be a Canadian connection. What we're interested in is the markets that we serve having development outcomes in those served. So if we're supporting a British investment or an Indian investment, like so be it, that's fine. We don't have any, or a domestic investment for that matter, fostering local investment. We're fine with that. And there's no difference we wouldn't treat a UK investor different than we would treat a domestic investor, for example. You made me think of something else, which was, so Canada happens to be the home of very deep-pocketed institutional investors, our pension fund. So CDPQ, the Canadian Pension Plan, Ontario Teachers, like we've got really deep-pocketed investors there. We would love to work with them, but we don't, like it's not a policy requirement. So we have been having a number of discussions and collaborations with them, particularly around platforms to bring more institutional investment into emerging markets. So we don't have to, but we would like to, and they would like to work with us as well.
Approximately how much will be the Canadian investors and how much is non-Canadian investors in
So
your portfolio?
So we don't have actually much Canadian investments at all in our portfolio, quite frankly. Yeah, so we don't, because again, we track it, but we don't have to have that Canadian connection. So we're mostly working with others.
Great.
Yeah.
And then introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Bhavani. I'm a second year MP and international development student. I had a couple of questions. The first question is on the geopolitical risk. So in the situation where we're right now, where there are rising geopolitical risks, do you see that countries are moving more towards energy security versus clean energy? So how is FinDev trying to mobilize private capital when there is a situation rising? And I think the second question is blended finance transaction cost is huge. So what is FinDev doing differently compared to other institutions to kind of address that?
Sorry, remind me of what your first question was with geopolitical tensions.
So countries are focusing more on energy security in comparison to clean energy. So then how difficult or do you actually see a shift in mobilizing private capital?
Yeah. So I think it's from my perspective, from where we sit, it's sort of too early to tell, right? Like, because there's been think about the JETPs, right? Like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships in South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Well, the US just pulled out of those, but there's still sort of 4 or 5 other countries that are part of that. It's too early to tell what's going to happen. So we're still doing renewable energy projects. We just did 2 last year on the Dominican Republic, solar. Our first deal in the Indo-Pacific region was a dozen or 8 solar PV, half with battery storage in Thailand. So there's still opportunity around that. I think the way that the impact of what's happening sort of geopolitically those cards will fall on the table eventually. I think right now it's too early to see. But we also have to keep in mind that in many cases and in many markets, the new build with renewables is actually cheaper than fossil, right? So it's about, are we keeping fossil? Are we keeping coal? Are we decommissioning coal? Are we building new coal? Are we using gas as an interim transition fuel, or are we going to renewables, right? So that calculus that's happening, because at the end of the day, where's the money going to come from? And if renewables are cheaper, like that economic decision is going to drive sort of the expansion plan, if you will, of a country-led energy sector development plan. And we're still seeing that so far in the countries that we're serving.
And the second question was regarding blended finance transaction costs.
Yeah, so the way that we approach blended finance, and so I think that, how should I put it? So indeed, blended finance does add costs, but it's good costs from a donor perspective because we're actually safeguarding those funds, right? Because what's the risk of blended finance? The risk of blended finance is actually a structuring approach. It's not an input. What is the input? The input is concessional finance, and concessional finance is different when you're talking about sovereign lending and when you're talking about private sector lending. So if we're using concessional finance for a private sector project, it's essentially off-market rate financing, right? And so the reason that there's added costs is because there's a perverse incentive, right? Like if you're my client, you want that at zero, right? If I'm the donor or if I'm managing this money on behalf of the donor, they want it as close to commercial as possible. So I need to have not just my investment officer that's dealing with my own capital, but I need to have another investment officer that's dealing with the blended finance, because you also want to get the deal done and you want the money cheap as possible. So I need to have somebody there that's safeguarding my donor's interests. So it is added costs, I would agree, but there's also some good reason behind that. The other reason that there's added costs is because it's new and novel structures, right? Like blended finance, even though blended finance has been around forever and used initially in developed market context to support ag investments and small and medium-sized enterprises and all of that. The term blended finance is a newish term of art, but that sort of subsidy element has been around forever and a day. So it does add cost. What we're trying to do at FinDev Canada is we're looking to deploy our concessional finance in two ways. One is in individual transactions, and the folks that we have working on blended finance have experience in blended finance. So we know, right? Like it was a new industry in the development finance context, I would say generally with the advent of the climate investment funds and then into the GCF and what have you. And then Jeff got into with the non-grain instruments into the space as well. But that's a relatively new industry. And so it takes time, right? Like the first project finance transaction, like it was really expensive as well, right? But because it's not a commodity, like project finance, blended finance, it's not a commodity. Okay, so but we've learned a lot in the last 15 or 20 years in blended finance. So the people that we have looking at blended finance have experience in it, know some of the pitfalls. We're also looking to optimize in that the folks that are looking at the blended finance are really looking at the structuring, everything else, the environmental and social, the business integrity, the climate, all of that. It's dealt with by the original team. We don't need to duplicate that because a blended finance is a structure, right? It's not, you're going to treat environmental and social different because it's blended than if you're going to treat it with your own capital. So we've streamlined that a lot. And so we're looking to deploy in individual transactions, but we're also spending time and resources in co-creating platforms, which are designed to mobilize private capital at scale. And the example that we have that was launched at COP last year is the co-creation of a platform with MUFG. So MUFG is a large Japanese bank, the largest non-state-owned bank in the world, if I'm not mistaken. And so we came together with them to co-create this platform. So it's a $1.5 billion platform. It is a fairly standard blended finance structure in that there's essentially like senior and junior first loss. We've got some technical assistance in there, a little sidecar technical assistance facility and foreign exchange facility and what have you. But it's focused on 25 emerging markets. We've got 70% adaptation. So we're trying to kind of crack a little bit of the adaptation, not 30% mitigation, but 70% focused on adaptation. And we got Green Climate Fund to also come into that. So that was a slog. That took a long time. But like we were able to, like we're in the process of putting together that $1.5 billion platform, which is a more efficient way than trying to mobilize $1.5 billion on the back of individual transactions. But at the end of the day, transactions happen. Not everything can be in a platform on day one. So we're looking at that sort of dual deployment strategy so that we can cover both parts of the business essentially, or both the way that pipeline originates, if you will. Is that helpful? Yeah.
We'll take a question from online and then maybe one or two after that, and then we'll close the session and move to the Graftons. So the question is, what's your experience in identifying good deals, right, as opposed to bad deals? How easy has it been to find deals in these markets that you're operating in? And, are there any trade-offs? I'll ask the question, as a new DFI, have you just been going for the low-hanging fruit, or have you been, kind of going for the harder, more riskier deals. And then, the final part of that question is, what's your relationship with other DFIs when it comes to the pipeline?
Yeah, so I'll tell the last question is an easy one. So with the other DFIs and even the MDBs, it's a very collegial group. I mean, we do a lot of co-financing together. Again, from the very early days, the European DFIs have really brought us into their fold. We share pipeline kind of openly. They participate in our deals. We participate in their deals. Good relationship with IUB Invest as well in LATAM. Some deals with IFC, and the Asian Development Bank has been a really great partner with us in Asia so far as well. So a lot of collegiality around the DFI MDB market. So good relationships there. So if I think about sort of good deals or how hard it is to find good deals, I'm not talking about FinDev Canada, but over the course of sort of my career, which has primarily been in the infrastructure space, like it's tough. It's really tough. The mortality rate is really, really high. For lots of reasons. One is like governments changing their minds, right? Like governments change their minds, or the structure isn't good. I mean, I joke, the reason I got all of this gray hair is by trying to deal with these concessions that were produced that were complete, Swiss cheese, which is why I went to the GIF to help put some of this gray hair to work to actually support governments in producing good concessions. But it's really hard because of that upstream project preparation, which is why project preparation is so critical when we're looking at public infrastructure pipelines, even if there's private investment in it. So it's tough, certainly in the infrastructure space, because at the end of the day, particularly in public-private partnerships, in some way, shape, or form, you may be relying on some sort of government form of payment, right? And so how high is that debt level for the government? What's the financial wherewithal of that government to actually make true on the payment? It's like, great, I've got a government guarantee, but it's like, really? Like, are they going to be able to pay on it? So, you really have, so it's tough. Infra is a tough space, but that's not to say that there aren't lots of opportunities, but they're highly, a lot of them are highly structured. I think that with the development of local and regional banks, there's really good opportunities of intermediated lending with banks, as well as sort of private equity has also, there's good domestic fund managers as well that are on their second and third funds. We're not in sort of the angel space or the VC space. We're more in the PE space, but there are good fund managers. We found great fund managers in Africa, for example, great ones.
Great, and I think if DFIs are to go down the route of kind of the easier deals, the low-hanging fruit, I mean, the easiest you can do is to write a check, to a bank in these markets, right? Because banks are regulated entities, generally speaking, and DFIs do lend to a lot of banks because banks can then on-lend to all corporates and SMEs, and they have the in-market knowledge that DFIs don't have. So if you look at BII, for example, from 2003 to 2011, it operated purely in an intermediate basis, right? And then only 2011 did it decide, okay, well, let's start doing direct investing. But it's harder to do direct investing. It takes much more resource and capability and skills.
But the intermediate business is really important, right? Because the backbone of growth in any market are small and medium-sized enterprises, right? And so if I'm looking at a smaller medium-sized enterprise that has like $1 million or $2 million in revenues, like how can I possibly do a good job, right? That's why you leverage the capillarity and the knowledge, as you were saying, of the local banking market, and then you have to again rigorously put use of proceeds conditions around that. We do a lot of on lending, as others do, for not just small and medium-sized enterprises, but women-led, women-owned small and medium-sized enterprises, or for green lines. So there's specific use of proceeds to make sure that the bank is going to get us as a DFI the development outcomes that we're looking for.
If you want to learn more on that, type in directed lending on the internet, and you'll come up with literature on that.
The one other sort of point that was made was about, like, are we just going for low-hanging fruit? So like the answer is no, we're not. And so how do we differentiate ourselves from commercial markets, from commercial finances, that we have a higher risk appetite? I have a stated higher risk appetite. I can take more risk than a commercial bank can, for example. That's part of my mandate. And what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to build a portfolio, right? So when I look at any individual investment opportunity, how does that sit in the portfolio from an impact return perspective, from a financial return perspective? And you have to have a balanced portfolio of both, right? So, but it's not always a trade-off saying, wow, if I go for a better credit, I'm going to have less impact. That's absolutely not the case. That's not what we're experiencing. You can have a good credit and have good development outcomes, right? But sometimes they're different opportunities are plotted differently, but you're trying to build that portfolio that again is financially self-sustaining. If I do some good credits, I can do some more risky credits and still have development outcomes across the portfolio.
One final question from there, and then we can move to.
Yeah, I'm Ray. So you talked about high risk appetite, but you also said that you're not into social infrastructure. And I just wanted to know, is there a particular reason why you're not into social infrastructure? Is it the scale? Is it the complexity? Or
Yeah, it's not that. It's actually not that complicated. We're a small DFI and we're growing. We just don't have the expertise in that. So as I'm hiring, I can either do a lot of things really thin, or I can do fewer things but deeper. And so our strategy is to do fewer things deeper. So we're sticking to the economic infrastructure. Social infrastructure is absolutely critical. We can support that indirectly through our intermediated business, right? So we've got private equity that invests in healthcare or housing or whatever. That's all fine. We wouldn't do it directly. I just don't have the expertise in-house to work in those sectors yet. But as we grow, we move up the league table of DFIs, maybe someday.
Yeah, great. One final one from Muskan.
Yeah, probably like an apt last question, but how do you view your exits, and how do you view impact post-exit as well? Like how long do you measure that for, and what are the kind of changes that you make?
Also an easy question, right?
Yeah, well, the truth of the matter is we haven't exited yet, because we're a young organization. So we've got investments that we haven't yet exited. But what we will do, and I mentioned it earlier, is we do the quality entry sort of diagnostic in terms of how do we expect the development, what do we expect for the development outputs and outcomes. We actually monitor that proactively during the life of the investment or the loan or whatever it is, on at least an annual basis. How is that particular client faring against what we thought they were going to do over time? Can we put in some corrective action plans? Can we provide some technical assistance if something's off track? And then the idea would be, because we're a signatory of the operating principles for impact management, we're developing the sustainable exit guidelines. Because again, what do we want to do? And it gets back to your question, I'm sorry that I didn't really answer about sort of what do we want to leave and why this is sort of good business, is that even after we leave, we want to make sure that there's longevity of jobs. We want to make sure that, we're supporting a company, but the jobs are still going to be there after that we leave. We're just not needed anymore because then they can get commercial finance, right? But the jobs are still there. And if the jobs are there, incomes are generated, tax revenue is generated, purchasing power goes up. So these are all good things. So we look at the we will be looking at the sustainability of the exit. We just don't have any exits yet. So I'll come back in a year or two and I'll let you know. How about that?
Lori, look, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.